The time I ruined my high school teacher's career and got her fired in the greatest way possible. This story is widely known amongst my family and is constantly brought up and joked upon in my group of friends even years later. A buddy of mine suggested that this is the perfect place to make it public, so let's get into this crap storm. Backstory: I was a senior in high school, and at the time I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student, and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important because to this day I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade and was widely known for being a pretty heartless bee who the administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject, so naturally I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some, these questions are easily answered, but to me it was rocket science. Usually when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again. Wow, surprise, surprise, you don't understand it again. Really, we have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" Etc., etc. Oh. I tried going to the administration about it before, but again, she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class. She would act respectful and normal for one day, and go back to being a bee the next. This went on for about half the year until I had enough. I went to the local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate to make up for the lost time. Go ahead. Feed the fire. Fast forward to the end of the year, and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote because it's burned into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for over 10 years, and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. We were allowed to dismiss yourself if you were 18. I went home, compiled all the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal, and we listened to a couple of the insults before he stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present as well as Mrs. Frank's. He told me we would meet up the next day where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walked into school the next morning being the most nervous I've ever been for anything. I was called down to the office where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Franks. What followed were some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators went from fed up with being in another useless meeting to furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Franks go from confident and stuck up to her realizing that she had effed up beyond repair. She was publicly roasting herself in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment, and the principal turned to me and said, "I think we have everything we need to. Thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes, and I gave her the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of her connections she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially because no school district in the area would hire this walking piece of garbage. If you're reading this, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you to go F yourself. Too long didn't read. My high school teacher belittled me all year. I secretly recorded her, showed the administrators, and got her fired. As someone who once wanted to be a teacher and has just a tremendous amount of respect for teachers and the amount of stress that they have to go through for typically too little pay, I think Mrs. Frank had this coming. That is awful what she was doing, to talk down to a student like that consistently. I could maybe understand if a teacher slipped up because they were just tired and frustrated after, weeks and weeks of just dealing with untold amount of stress and just let strip, just like, "Oh my God, what a dumb question. No, sorry," something like that. A single slip up one can kind of excuse to a point. Though still, you shouldn't be doing that with students. That is part of your job is to help them, and that is the opposite. But to be consistently doing that to a student is abuse. That's cruel. You are wearing down a student's, mental well-being. This is emotional hell for a student, to be mocked and ridiculed by a teacher in front of other students. I'm sorry, she doesn't deserve to be teaching. To be doing that much, yeah, I agree that she should have lost that job and probably shouldn't be rehired unless she goes through some pretty extensive work that I don't even know what it would be. But yeah, sorry, Mrs. Frank, but you had that coming. Today, I effed up by giving my son permission to beat his bully's butt. My son was born with a condition called pectus excavatum. In layman's term, his chest is sunken in. His condition was so bad that he only had 2.5 inches between his sternum and his spine, and his heart and lungs were bruised because of it. In December, he had surgery to correct it, and they put 2 nickel bars in his chest to give it space and train his bones to grow correctly. About 3 weeks after his surgery, a kid punched him and dislodged the top bar, and he had to have another surgery to put the bar back in place. This kid has been through a lot. Well, the doctor cleared him for most activities last week, just no skateboarding or bike riding, but he could now lift his backpack and go hang out with friends and play pickup, non-contact sports. Unbeknownst to me, a kid in his class had been bullying him all semester, and because my son was afraid of getting hit again, he just took it. Well, the evening he was cleared, he came to me and said, "Dad, I'm cleared now. A kid has been bullying me and hitting me for months. Can I kick his butt?" Well, my son isn't really a fighter. He's fought with his brothers, but never anyone else, and he's always gotten his butt kicked. So I just figured he was just talking, but this is the first I'd heard about the bullying, and I was concerned. I could tell he was distressed about the situation, so I told him to knock the effer out. He just nodded and went to his room. Now, his older brother is a tough SOB. He had a traumatic brain injury 2 years ago, and he missed a year of school, so he's in the same grade and coincidentally takes the same class. I talked to him about it and told him to handle it, but don't get in trouble. He told me that the kid walks in every day and punches my son in the head. I asked him why he allowed that to happen, and he said he wanted his brother to get tough, and once he was tired of getting hit, he would do something about it. While I kinda agree with his thinking, I instructed him to handle it without getting in trouble. The next morning, I took them both to school and drove back home to get my younger daughter, who goes to a different school that starts later. On the way to take her to school, my wife calls me, "Have you taken blank to school yet? Well, after you do, go pick up your son. He got in a fight." I just assumed it was my oldest son. Imagine my surprise when I walked into the school office to see my younger son with a grin from ear to ear. He was beaming. He pointed to another kid sitting in a chair holding an ice pack on his face. I warned him. I was so proud. He had walked into class, sat down, and the kid popped him in the head like always. My older son got up to intervene, and before he could, my son decked the kid with one punch. He said the kid was bawling on the floor and that it was the best day of his life. He got suspended for 3 days. Too long didn't read. I gave my son permission to beat up his bully because I didn't think he would, and he did it. Edit 1. The kid who punched my son in the chest was one of his friends. It wasn't malicious, just 2 boys clowning around. He was horrified that he had hurt my son. The bully punched my son in the head every day. Once he found out my son couldn't do anything about it, he just kept on. My son wasn't the only one he bullied either. Also, the bully's brother came to my son later and told him that he had warned him once my son could fight that he was going to get his butt kicked. Edit 2. My son has some social anxiety, and since the fight has made a lot of new friends, he used to hate going to school, but now he's disappointed that school is out for summer. Crazy. Edit 3. Thanks for the precious medals. And holy crap, front page? Boy, this is a tough one because I'm not an advocate for violence. I think that there are times when you do need to defend yourself. I'm not going to say that violence should never, ever occur. Violence, I wish violence wouldn't occur, but using violence in self-defense, sometimes if you have to, I don't know. I'm not an expert, okay? I'm not the smartest on these things. I will say this person's hitting your kid every day because they know they can't, fight back, and, Your kid's worried about getting hit in the chest because, I would imagine it's even maybe life-threatening or something. Going into surgery is not a small ordeal, so I can see why he'd be concerned, and you certainly want to do something about it. I don't know if that was the right decision, but I am glad that, it helped your son come out of his social anxiety shell and get a bully to stop bullying him, because bullying sucks, and bullies are often going through their own things and do need help, but seriously, they're accountable for their actions. I don't know. There's a lot going on here, and I really don't know where to land on all this, and, I know it seems like I'm just doing it for engagement when I say I'd love to hear from folks in the comments, but I seriously would, especially like parents or people who are dealing with bullies, because I'm neither of those things. I dealt with a bully a little bit in high school, but it was kind of not, whatever. But I am curious to know what people think, because, yeah, I don't know. This is complicated. Am I the a-hole flipping out on my fiance for canceling all the vegan food options from our wedding food menu behind my back? My fiance, 31 male, and I, 25 female, are getting married soon. There wasn't much to disagree on during the wedding planning except for food. Me and my family are vegans, and there are so many reasons why we chose this lifestyle, and one of them being that we have a history of health issues. My fiance and his family are the complete opposite. They're hardcore meat eaters, which is fine by me, obviously. However, when deciding on the wedding food menu, I wanted to add 4 to 5 vegan options. My fiance and his mom objected, saying it was a waste of money over food that isn't real food. They also argued that this would be offensive for their guests and suggested my vegan options just be the good old salads and appetizers. His mom wanted cupcakes. I said no because, for one, it's me and my family who's paying, and 2, I want to make my guests feel welcome and not be treated as second-class citizens by being served salad. My fiance made a face and said, "Isn't that what vegans eat?" I refused to argue about it and said it was final. The other day I found out that he had canceled all the vegan options and took them off the menu completely and behind my back. I was seething. I called him at work, but he kept hanging up on me. I went straight to his workplace and confronted him there and just flipped out on him. He was stunned to see me. He at first said it was his mom's idea, that then told me to go home because I was making a scene at the office. The fight continued at home, and he defended himself by saying that I sort of made him resort to doing this after I kept brushing off his thoughts and input and refusing to accommodate his family, but there were plenty of meat options. Why can't I get 4 to 5 vegan options when I'm paying for it? He yelled that it was his wedding too, not my family's. My family said it was fine and they'd figure it out and told me to let it go, but I refused. Am I the a-hole for putting my foot down on this? Update. So his mom messaged me earlier to try to get me to listen to what she had to say after I kept ignoring her phone calls. She sent long walls of text just to address what I did at her son's workplace, calling it all kinds of stuff from immature to unhinged. She then went on to explain how she's noticed that me and my family kept acting dismissive of her son's input and contributions to the wedding. She said that she noticed my behavior towards him and her entire family and wanted to speak up earlier but didn't, and tried to keep the peace. She then went on to address the food menu issue and denied her involvement in the cancellation of the vegan option, but that didn't mean she doesn't support her son's decision. Moreover, she thought it was so responsible of him to make that move because of my continual refusal to see how this stuff is a waste of money. She also pointed out how I kept saying I paid for it and said that technically this isn't just my money, it's mine and his because we're getting married. She suggested I wisen up and get rid of my money I paid for it mentality. She finally mentioned how bad this whole situation is making me look and said that she and her son had already offered a number of compromises that I chose to brush off and decided to make it my weird hill to die on. She said that not only her son is upset, but she and the family are as well after hearing about it, and suggested I just agree on their compromise and be done with it. This peed me off beyond belief. I responded by letting her know that I'm still standing my ground on this, even if I'll have to call the whole wedding off because of it Because honestly, this is just ridiculous. It is. My mom and dad, they don't even know what to say anymore. Apparently my fiance saw my response to her, he's with her, and is now trying to call me, but right now I'm waiting on him to get home and see if he's still insisting on the stance he took. So obviously we're only getting the poster's perspective and not the her fiance's perspective, because who knows, maybe the poster has been unreasonable in some other ways. I don't know. We're going to just assume that the poster is being extremely forthcoming with us. We're going to take what we're getting here. First off, I'm not a vegan. I was a vegetarian for a year. I eat meat now, but I have a lot of respect for vegans, and I also love a lot of vegan dishes. I don't eat meat every meal. I like vegan stuff. And to just be like, they could just have salads. What an a-hole thing for them to do. Yeah, let me just say right now, I don't think that the poster is an a-hole. I think the poster is being reasonable to want vegan options when there are already meat options. Because there might be plenty of other people coming to the wedding, other friends from both sides that are like, ooh, a nice little fried tofu blend or something. I'll get that. I don't need meat. Like, I know that there's this stereotypical joke online about vegans being obnoxious about veganism, but this doesn't sound like that. Like, she's fine having meat options at the wedding. She's fine that her fiancé and his family are meat eaters. She has no problem with this. It doesn't sound like she's putting up a big stink, would just like some vegan options because that's what her and her family have. I don't care. I wouldn't care if the fiancé's family was paying for every single thing. It's both of their wedding. Respect your fiancé. Respect both people's wants and both families. My God, it's not that hard. Honestly, I wouldn't blame this woman if she canceled the wedding, because it sounds like her husband's a bit of an a-hole. To cancel that behind her back is just gross. So, I don't know. That's where I land on this. But how about you?
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.